Okay, I think we're live. I'm Mark Angelotti, the host of the Infinite Regress YouTube channel, and I have here with me Dr. Clint Heacock of the Mindshift Podcast and Facebook page. So can I call you Clint?
Sure, yeah. Actually, it's Heacock, but nobody, everyone gets it wrong.
Okay, it looks like Peacock, so people call it.
I know. It's one of those funny English names, so it doesn't actually work.
Well, now is that why you're in the United Kingdom now? Is you kind of decide to go back to your roots, or what is that about?
Well, I came over here to do a PhD about almost 15 years ago now. But yes, my father's side of the family is English, so that was I love history, and I have done a lot of family research. I've gone back to my sort of roots where my family comes from in Staffordshire. They were actually Quakers in the 16th and 17th century. So it's a fascinating story anyway. But yeah, I found my roots sort of a thing too.
Yeah, that's great. Now, so I guess I want to know about your story because, me being raised in a secular family, I don't have the vantage point of somebody who's seen Christianity I've seen it from the inside in the sense I've gone to church before, but never really been, really involved with it in the extent that you have. So I'd like to know, were you raised in a Christian family, and what was it like? And then how did it evolve as you got older?
Yes, I was raised in a Christian family. We went to a Church of Christ, which was located just outside of Seattle, Washington, which is where I grew up. We lived there we went to church there till I was about 16. And we left and went to another church. But yeah, I was raised in it. It was I would say now a fundamentalist church, certainly conservative, evangelical. They were part of the Bill Gothard Institute and Basic Youth Conflicts, which is what it was known at the time. And I consider that a cult, really. So that was kind of my background, raised in a very conservative, if not cultic, fundamentalist sort of background.
Okay. So would you say that you were going to church every Sunday, or even more often than once a week? That's yeah.
We were there, man. I was raised from day one. I was a baby. I remember, but I was, my mom brought me to church when I was probably a week or two old, and I was there every Sunday. We went to services on Wednesday nights. We had all sorts of activities. We lived at the church building 3, 4, 5 days a week on some, we had VBS in the summertime and summer camp and all the rest of it. So we were heavily involved.
Okay. So VBS is Vacation Bible School for those who might not know, but so I'm going to guess at some point, I'll just ask it this way. Yeah.
There's a lot of glare on my glasses. I just noticed.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just ask it this way though. Let's say up until the time you were 16, did you ever have any doubts about the validity of the faith?
I would say that it wasn't, it was a case of the faith wasn't working for me. Maybe I could see it now as doubts, but back then I was trying desperately to make it work. So I kept getting baptized, ended up getting baptized about 3 times because it wasn't working. It didn't take the first time. So I did it again, and then I did it again. And so that was really my cycle, was that I was so desperate to make it work. And so the problems that I were having, I was always putting it down to my fault, so whatever doubts I was having, it wasn't that God was letting me down. It was that I wasn't somehow, up to snuff. So that's why I kept getting baptized, and I kept trying harder and harder to make it work. So I was really stuck in this cycle of anxiety, I would say, and sort of religious scrupulosity. I think that's the way to describe it now.
And was those 3 baptisms, were those all before you were 18 or whatever, or is that some of those later on?
The first one I was baptized, I was probably around 10 or 11. I had seen the movie, which is called A Thief in the Night, which they showed in our Sunday service one night. And that was about, people who were raptured and the end times tribulation and all that, and people who got left behind. And that movie absolutely terrified me. So I got baptized when I was about 10 or 11. I got baptized again when I was 13 or so. And then I walked away from the faith at about 16, came back to it, ended up becoming a youth pastor down in Portland when I was going to Bible college. and I got baptized the third and final time. I was probably in my mid-20s. So it was much, much later after I'd come back to the faith.
Okay, so you're at Bible college and you're taking another shot at it. Basically, you're really trying to get into it. But so at some point, did you ever decide at that point then to kind of say? Did you ever say, well, maybe it's not just me. Maybe there's something wrong with the underlying theology or assumptions about it?
I see now that my desire to go into academics, because I went heavily into it. I wanted to be a pastor and a teacher. I can see now, though, that I think a lot of my motivation was I was trying to help people avoid the pitfalls and the problems that I had growing up. That was really my motivation. I wanted to teach people from the Bible. And so I thought the more I'll dig and drill down into it, I'll understand the faith more. I'll understand the theology more. I'll understand the Bible better, and I'll be able to explain it to other people and help them spiritually, so they won't fall into the same traps that I did. And so that's what kept me going for a long time. I just kept doing more degrees and studying Greek and studying Hebrew and studying theology. And I kept thinking, I'm going to come to the end of this thing at some point, they're going to find out the answer somewhere. Surely.
Right. So does that mean that when you reached some of these endpoints and you got your degrees, does that mean there was some sort of letdown at that point? Because it's like, okay, now I've got this degree, but I still feel like I wish there's something I didn't learn that I thought I was going to learn, kind of thing, or no?
I think it was just the ongoing journey. I mean, I love academics anyway. I'm a researcher and a teacher at heart, so I love studying and I love writing. So it wasn't necessarily a hardship from that point of view, because I did enjoy the study and the digging into all this stuff. And I was going deeper into learning Hebrew and learning Greek. And I thought there's a lifetime that you can spend, obviously, just in biblical scholarship if you want to get into Greek and Hebrew. And I mean, it's an unbelievable amount of study and hard work. So I kept thinking I'll keep doing that. I'll keep doing another degree and I'll do it and I'll figure it all out. And then when I came over here to do my PhD, that's kind of the end of the line, academically. That's sort of the terminal degree. And so I thought, this is it. I'm going to get a PhD. And I did it in biblical studies and preaching. I was going to combine all those things that I'd been learning and in a way to preach it and to proclaim it so that other people can benefit from it. But it was during that PhD that I was already kind of having a lot of questions and problems anyway. And my supervisor was really good because he was really gentle about pointing out my own presuppositions and biases that I wasn't even seeing, and he would circle things in red on my on my chapters that I would turn in, and he would say, like, are you sure you want to say this? Are you sure that you want to, you can write that if you want, but you're going to have to defend that. And that made me stop and go, okay, well, why would I say that? Why would I? And I was putting out some pretty dogmatic statements. And I thought, my God, where's this coming from? Why am I putting this stuff out? And that's when I really started looking at my own set of biases. And I thought, God, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that I really need to examine thoroughly. And I just jettisoned a lot of that.
So what kind of biases are you talking about? I mean, are you saying that your mentor was actually maybe more liberal than you were, or?
Oh yeah, he definitely was. I mean, I went to the University of Chester, which is technically a Church of Anglican college, university, but it's in the UK. It's totally different than like a seminary in the States. I mean, if you go to most seminaries in the States or Bible colleges, they're going to be on the more conservative side. I mean, you can find more liberal ones, but here in the UK and in Europe, it's a lot more open. I mean, we had a guy, for example, one of the first days I was there, one of the lecturers, he taught New Testament and he was openly gay, and I thought, okay, this is different. I mean, you wouldn't find that in a Bible college in America, not a conservative one for sure. Right. We had a Muslim imam who was also on the theology and religious studies department, so that's how inclusive and open it was. So it was really a good experience. So yeah, he pushed me really gently into seeing my own biases. But it was stuff like, when it came to interpreting the Bible, I was really coming out of a fundamentalist sort of conservative mindset where you had to find the intent of the author, and you had to understand there was one meaning to the text, and you had to discover what that one meaning was, and that was the legitimate meaning, and I was going into this kind of postmodern worldview where it was like, actually, there's a lot of potential meanings and interpretations here, and that was rocking my world, especially when you get ready to preach it, because if you put a method forth that allows people to dialogue, that is very unsettling to a lot of people who want to control the narrative. So I was getting into trouble with some of the conservative people, who didn't like my methods.
Sure. So it sounds like, in a way, that, well, at least from my perspective, it sounds like maybe you could have stayed with maybe a more liberal view of Christianity, but eventually, though, you left Christianity entirely, right? So what was that process like? I mean, what were sort of like the stepping stones of you getting out of Christianity?
Well, we were talking the other day, and I used the analogy that I said that someone told me that deconstructing, it's like two train tracks. They're parallel tracks. One of them is you have to deconstruct your relationship with the church, and the other one is deconstructing your biblical beliefs. And I was doing both of those because, on the one hand, I had been a pastor of a church for about 12 years in Portland before I went over here to the UK. And we had a really rough experience. I got really burned out. We ended up closing down the church. I got burned very, very badly by some people in the church. And so as a result of that, I was really questioning whether or not I even wanted to be involved in a church at all. I didn't want to have anything to do with Christians or churches, but I still very much believed in God. I actually was trying to go down this route of sort of saving the church from itself. That was my goal for the last 7 or 8 years, where I was really getting into progressive Christianity. And I had this real motive of, I wanted to reform the church. I wanted to help the church. I wanted to make it more relevant. And that was part of my motivation for doing my PhD. But then the other track started kicking in. It was like I was questioning my own theological beliefs because I had been reading a lot of real progressive Christians. And I thought, God, there's a lot of the stuff that I used to think was absolutely indispensable, and I was jettisoning most of it. And by the time I came down to the end, I realized there was nothing left. So those two tracks sort of ran to their logical conclusion. I didn't want to have anything to do with church or Christians anymore. And then I realized I wasn't a Christian. I didn't believe it anymore either.
Okay. So, obviously, growing up, you probably believed in the inerrancy of the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament and everything. But at some point, I guess maybe at some point in your studies, when you were encouraged to kind of take maybe a skeptical view towards inerrancy, maybe that was would that be considered like one of the steps towards leaving Christianity?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. It's funny because I remember seeing years ago, there's a famous cartoon or like a comic strip from about 1910. And it's the fundamentalists and the liberals who were having this big culture war. And that was one of the big things. The big sticking points was the liberals were questioning the inerrancy and the inspiration of the Bible. And there's this famous cartoon of a guy walking down a set of steps, and each step has a label on it. And the first step is inspiration, and then inerrancy, creation, the virgin birth, and you're denying all these things. And when you get to the bottom, it's you're in this basement and you're in this atheism, you've lost God. And I thought, that's kind of my journey right there.
Yeah.
I can resonate with that little comic strip, because you think, okay, you start questioning and you go down those steps, and by the time you get to the bottom, there's nothing left.
Okay. So then at some point you decide to do more than just leave Christianity. You decide you want to help people who are similar, who've been through a similar experience. Is that right? That's the purpose behind the podcast and other things like that.
Well, it's funny because when I've been doing the podcast for a little over 4 years now. When I started out, it was originally called, it was a different name. It wasn't called Mindshift Podcast. It was called the Preacher's Forum. And that was the name of the podcast. And that was my last sort of gasp of trying to reform the church. So I was doing it from a real progressive Christian point of view. I wanted to encourage dialogue and discussion in a forum type of way. So if you look at my early episodes, I first about 12 or 13, were just me telling my story of how I came out of the church, but I still very much believe. I was interviewing sort of, Christian progressives and trying to reform the church. But what I was doing was I was deconstructing sort of in front of a live audience, and at a certain point, about a year and a half in, I realized that name no longer fit what I was trying to do. So I changed the name of the podcast. It took a long time. I dumped my website, which was called the Preachers Forum. I had to get rid of all those associations with my old former self. And I thought, this is kind of a metaphor of my own journey. It's very difficult to change a website address and to change a podcast name and all the artwork and everything. But I thought, that's kind of a symbol of my own journey.
Okay. So let me ask you this then. When you look out at Christianity today and you see, you see the evangelical, the maybe fundamentalist Christianity, and you also see the more liberal types of Christianity. Do you think that you think either of them really offer something to people that to where if you met somebody who was involved in a Christian church, do you feel a desire to persuade them to leave that church, or do you feel like Christianity for some people is sort of like something they just kind of have to have in order to enjoy their lives? Or do you feel like maybe there's a lot of reason for people to leave because they could realize their full potential if they did leave?
Well, there's a lot in what you just said. For one thing, I think sociologically, you have to say that where people are born and the environment in which they're raised has a huge amount of bearing on the religion that they come to believe in. For example, look at different countries of the world. If you and I were born in Saudi Arabia or China or something, we would be Muslims or Buddhists or Taoists, or chances are greater that we would be following those religions if that's where we were born. So just from a sociological point of view, a lot of people are Christians because, for example, they're born in the West or they're born in America. So their parent, like me, I was raised in it. My parents were Christians. I believed it all from day one. I just thought it was all true. And, we heard the story of that, kind of how it went for me. And so many people have that same experience, and I would say that I'm not trying to talk anybody out of becoming a Christian. What I want to do is get them to think. I want them to question things. And if that's what I'm succeeding in doing with my podcast and my writing and stuff, then I'm all for that. I'll talk to anybody, but I don't generally get into arguments with Christians. Some people on Twitter and stuff, they get into, these evangelicals just come after them, and they don't really come after me. And I think maybe it's because I'm not really attacking them. I'm interested in a dialogue. I just want to talk.
So what kind of dialogue would you like to have with a conservative evangelical Christian pastor, for example?
Well, there's a lot we could talk about. We could talk about, for example, the politicization of evangelicalism in America. That's a big hot topic. In fact, for me, that was my final and ultimate last straw when I saw that in 2016, this fervent support for Donald Trump by the evangelical side. And that's when I said, okay, I am now officially no longer a Christian. I don't want to be called a Christian. I don't want to have anything to do with Christianity because of that. That was the last straw. And a lot of people are going down that line. So if I was talking to a pastor, I'd be talking to him about the trends of where this thing is going to go. Where do you think the church is going to end up? Because it's not going to end well, for this political sort of, in America anyway. I've done a lot of research on what's called dominion theology, Christian Reconstructionism. There's a tremendous amount of stuff going on right now that's really concerning because it's affecting legislation for all kinds of people. So, and the church is right in the middle of that. So that's one thing we could talk about. I don't know how good of a discussion we would have, but there's a lot to talk about.
Well, I mean, and let's say you were talking, you ran into somebody on Twitter who's like a progressive pastor of a church. What would you mostly say? Keep doing what you're doing because you're helping people. Or do you still think that when people attend a progressive church, that there's still perhaps some problems with the structure, of that faith too? Do you think there's some problems with progressive Christianity?
Well, that's it. And it's a good example. I was talking about the fundamentalists and the liberals from about a century ago. And essentially, things go in cycles. And you can see what happened to the liberal side of Christianity. The fundamentalists went down, they doubled down. So they went down the route of the inspiration, the inerrancy, the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, the virgin birth. You had to believe all these certain things to be a Christian. And the evangelicals of today are kind of an offshoot, second, third, fourth generation of those fundamentalists. But then when the liberals, they tried to incorporate their faith with modern science and psychology and psychiatry and, evolution and all the rest of it. But it ended up kind of washing the whole thing out. And that's why I feel like in some ways progressive Christianity, it's so expansive that there's really not much left. And I find there's a lot of infighting between progressive Christians. There's a lot. I've seen people where they've gotten absolutely ripped to shreds by other progressives. So it's not necessarily the safest space. You'd think it would be, though. But yet, I had a couple guys on my podcast last year. One guy is like a complete progressive Christian, and he said to me that he wrote a book, and he said the worst lambasting he got was from other progressives about his book.
Yeah.
He kind of was not expecting that. He thought, wow, this is going to be great. No, it was very rough, and they just tore him to shreds. So you think, God, that's not very liberal. If that's the definition of liberalism, is to be inclusive and accepting, and no, it's not. It can be just as fundamentalist on the liberal side as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when you think about you think about maybe a couple of generations ago, Christian leaders, for example, Jerry Falwell on the one hand, Martin Luther King Jr. on the other, right? Mm-hmm. Both religious people, but really representing totally different sides of the political spectrum. But now in America, I think maybe you'll agree with this. In America, it really seems like when you think of Christianity, your mind tends to gravitate towards that conservative side of Christianity. Mm-hmm. Whereas what you're describing to me in the United Kingdom is that when people breathe the word Christianity there, the first thing that pops into their head is not some conservative Christian person. It may be somebody who's actually pretty liberal, right?
Yeah, I mean the Church of England is pretty liberal. I mean you can find obviously very conservative churches here, but for example, the word evangelical here in Great Britain does not mean what it means in the United States. And you don't see the politicization of the church here in this country and most of Europe. You don't, even though ironically we still have a state church. We have the Church of England, which is technically it's funded by the state. And so even the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's the head of the Church of England. When he gets public pronouncements, it still gets pretty good press. So there's a higher profile in that regard, but you don't see evangelicals, Christians involved in politics like you do in America. Not even close.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does seem like the two issues for a long time anyway, the two issues that really captivated conservative Christianity is the abortion issue and the homosexuality issue. Mm-hmm. But now, there is gay marriage in the United States and all 50 states due to the Supreme Court decision. And the polls seem to show that overwhelming majority of Americans support gay marriage now. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't seem to be a real movement to take same-sex marriage away. Although I imagine there's obviously some people who would like to do that, but it doesn't seem like the political will is really there amongst the broader population. But the abortion issue is still a live issue. That's the one that is really it's as hot as it ever has been, really.
Yeah, it may be hotter now because, like you said, those two planks were what the fundamentalists like Jerry Falwell Sr., when he established the moral majority in 1979, it was to help get Ronald Reagan elected. And he was the first president, or the candidate, I should say, who really got in bed with the evangelical and fundamentalist side. And what the genius of a guy like Falwell was he was able to put the Catholics and the fundamentalists together, which had never been done before, and create a giant voting bloc to help propel Reagan into office. And they thought that Reagan was going to turn around and outlaw Roe versus Wade and all that. And it didn't happen, obviously. But now we're seeing with the Trump administration, the problem is, you say that it's true. The majority of Americans don't want to overturn, gay marriage and abortion. But yet there's this evangelical advisory board that have Trump's ear, and they've got this majority of Supreme Court justices, so they're thinking in their lifetimes, Roe versus Wade is going to get overturned. And they're all for what they call family values, which means one man, one woman. So that does not include same-sex marriage. It does not include transgender, period.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some respects, I almost wonder, I almost wonder if maybe like the emergence of Trump in an ironic way is really a result of sort of the weakness to some extent of the Christian conservatives, because you take the previous Republican president, George W. Bush, who really was an evangelical Christian. Yeah. Nobody. I don't know very many people who seriously think that Donald Trump is an evangelical Christian or any kind of Christian, really. I mean,
Pence is, though, for sure.
Yeah,
no doubt.
Yeah, no doubt about that. There's no question.
No doubt.
There. So there was sort of that compromise, but I think that initially, I think the conservative Christians were really upset that Trump got the nomination in 2016 because they felt like here we got a casino strip club owner who's now got the Republican nomination. Yep. And but then once he got into office and he started doing the bidding of the Christian conservatives, all of a sudden you can't really. I mean, it seems like most Christians are not willing to say any negative words about him.
Well, and they'll go out and defend him and provide religious cover for him. We've seen that time and time again. I mean, when the Access Hollywood tape came out, for example, even when he was a candidate, like James Dobson went out and said, well, first of all, it was locker room talk. And second, that was before he was a Christian. He's a Christian now. So, it's horrific and terrible what he said, but he wouldn't say that now because, and so he was providing that religious cover. But I think you're right. You could look at it that way. You could say, well, is this the last sort of gasp of evangelicalism? And so they're seeing it as this is their final parting shot. They better get this right, because if they don't, I see it as they made a deal with the devil, because it's a transactional thing, isn't it? He was using them. They were using him. They helped to get him into office. But then like with Reagan, they said, now you've got to pay your debts back to us. And he actually is doing that. Sure. Whereas Reagan didn't, at least not in the way they thought he would. He did to some extent, but they were kind of overall disappointed with Reagan. He didn't really deliver on all of the promises they thought he was going to make, So Trump is, though.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting to look at the United Kingdom, because you still have, actually you have more than two parties in the United Kingdom, whereas in the United States you really have two major parties, but you do have the liberal Democrats, right? In addition to Labor and Conservative Party, but you have this very competitive party system. But what's interesting is that recently the Conservatives won a big victory in the United Kingdom, but you don't have, we're told anyway out here in the United States that in the United Kingdom, Christianity is on the decline, and Christianity is not very big in the United Kingdom anymore. Is that your impression living there?
That is true. It's true overall across Europe that the numbers are declining. If you go to your typical cathedrals, let's say in Europe or here in the United Kingdom, you'll find the average population is about 70 years old and primarily female. So that tends to be an interesting demographic. They're desperate for younger families to become part of churches, whereas you don't see that. There's a couple of mega churches and things, but like in this country, mega churches just are not a thing. You have a very, very few, but not like in America where you got a church on every street corner, Right. There's a few. I went to one up in Manchester years ago. I actually went to see Rob Bell speak, and it was surprisingly a mega church. And I thought, whoa, this is kind of interesting. I didn't think they had these things in this country, but it was a big, massive church right in the city center of Manchester.
Well, I can't help but ask this because, someone as knowledgeable as you are about, about theology and the Bible also. When I see on YouTube or or on Twitter where someone says, an evangelical Christian says, the consensus of scholars says that it's like this minimal facts argument for Jesus's resurrection. They say, there is a consensus of scholars that says that the followers of Jesus saw him rise from the dead, that he was buried in the tomb prepared for him by Joseph of Arimathea, blah blah blah, and they make it seem like there's just a complete consensus on all these facts, But then then I read books by Bart Ehrman, Dr. Bart Ehrman, and I get a totally different sense of what the consensus really is about the accuracy of the Bible, of the New Testament, etc. Now, what is your view? I mean, who's telling the truth here when we talk about this consensus of New Testament scholars or whatever that is?
They certainly agree that the New Testament presents that narrative, don't they? That there's no question about that. And I remember as a Christian, that was a big one, wasn't it? Where you're looking at the story of the resurrection. That's really the cornerstone of the Christian faith. If you take that away, and I think that's probably explains why they're so desperate to fight to keep it, to preserve it. Because if you take the resurrection away, the whole Christianity, the case for Christianity just crumbles. And that's a huge problem, That's an issue. But I remember talking to a guy, his name's David Fitzgerald. I don't know if you've come across his works, but he's
I have.
Yeah, he's written Jesus Mything in Action, as in MYTH, Mything in Action.
Sure.
And we talked a couple of years ago, and he said to me that once you take the biblical record out of the picture, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection almost completely nothing. There's nothing there in terms of Roman history. There's one mention in Josephus, but that's turned out to be a forgery. It's not accurate. So once you take away that and the Gospels, you're left with very little evidence that Jesus of Nazareth, the person in the Gospels, actually even may have existed. I'm not sure about that, but Christians are going to just go nuts the second you start suggesting that Jesus may not have even existed.
Yeah, no, that's right, and because if you were to accept, if you accept the claims of the Gospels, well, then it's a slam dunk that Jesus was resurrected. But if you start questioning any of it, then it really does become much harder to justify, because
that's it.
There's a whole hypothesis that that some people. Well, you could always argue that somebody fabricated the story. You could argue that, but anyway, there's this belief that, hey, all the scholars believe X, but I get the feeling there's a lot more diversity amongst the scholars. I think what they're talking about is scholars who work at universities, Christian universities, where you're required to believe in the inerrancy of the Bible in order to work there.
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to get a job, because I can remember I've applied for jobs when I was finishing up my PhD, both in the States and over here. There are a few conservative Bible colleges and seminaries in this country. Obviously, the States are littered with them, and almost every one of them, you'd get this application pack, like you said, and toward the end of the pack, there'd be a page that you had to read and sign, and you agree with their doctrinal statement. Otherwise, there's not even a point in applying for the position if you don't sign that doctrinal statement and agree with it. So that right there says to me exactly what you said. You're going to have to toe the party line even to be considered a candidate for a potential job, let alone be able to teach there. I think going back to your point about the Gospels, it's circular logic, though, isn't it? Yes, they all sort of agree internally on the bare bones facts, or the narrative, I should say. But if you take that and remove that from the discussion, then what are you left with? And even then, the Gospels are not very consistent. I remember one of the things I used to have my students do when I taught the New Testament was we would do readings in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are the most similar Gospels, and I would have them compare parallel passages and talk about why there's so many differences between the three. And they had major problems, because at first they would always say, well, they all say the same thing. No, they don't. There's some pretty wide divergence between what they call the synoptic Gospels. And then John is hardly has any stuff that the other three have.
Sure. So, but as a former Christian, I wonder if you think that there's something that us non-Christians, sort of need that the Christians do have, like for example, community. Do we need to do we need to have atheist churches or agnostic churches where we show up on Sunday, but not to praise God, but to have a potluck with each other and
be in community
and have music and so on? I mean, is that something we really need, or is that kind of, can we dispense with that as in addition to all the dogmas and the doctrines?
I think this is a really good question because someone said to me that when you're reconstructing, you're putting all the pieces back together after you've left your faith or your religion or a cult or whatever. One of the things is you have to go back and pull out. There are some good things. It's not all uniformly bad. There's a lot of things that I learned. There's a lot of things that were beneficial. And one of the things, as you point out, is community. Now, that's not unique to Christianity. They didn't invent it, but it's something that humans need, I think. So that's why there's things like Sunday assembly and other kind of gatherings where it might be an atheist or humanist gathering, but they've recognized that we need community. It's a beneficial thing for our own mental health, and it's good to help other people and be in relationships with other. If you can remove the religious elements out of it, happy days.
Yeah, but it also seems like you have to have some sort of shared something that ties you together. Like maybe you're all interested in sewing or chess. Could be anything.
Cameras, could be any club. I mean, I coach American football, what they call American football in this country.
Oh yeah,
that's something I played for 8 years for a team in Chester. That became my church or community where I walked away from the church and I found community with a bunch of guys around American football. And I found it where I live here in North Wales now. We have a biker club. I'm not part of it, but the three houses around in our community, everyone's in this club. And so we have huge gatherings and rallies. And I know most of the people in the club. Our band plays gigs for their rallies. And, so that's another form of community that I've found. And it's, like you said, it's around either football or motorcycles or music or whatever. It has nothing whatsoever to do with any sort of religion.
Yeah. And maybe that's the healthiest way to have community is.
But I recognize I need it, and that's the thing. It's something that we really, really do need. We need, friendship, relationships, fellowship, as Christians would say, but without the religion. Because I'm not doing it because the Bible tells me that I need to have fellowship. I'm doing it because as a human, I recognize that sociologically, we're better off in relationships with other people, and I can help other people and they can help me, and we can, and all that. It's great. But there's no religious motivations whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Clint, I appreciate you joining me on my channel. And I've just this morning, I've listened to one of your podcasts. It was very interesting. It was with the former preacher from West Texas. What is his name?
Oh, Tim Sledge.
Yes. And that was
Jesus.
Yeah. And that was a really good conversation. And I want to listen to more of your podcasts because you've been doing this for a while. It looks like I have a big backlog to catch up on, but I'll just say I appreciate you coming on, and I hope everybody will tune into the next Mindshift podcast.
Yeah. In fact, we've got a really good one coming out this Friday with Stephanie McCown. She wrote the book called Raised Evangelical. That's RAZED. And it's a fascinating story because we both grew up in fundamentalism. And so we had a really good discussion about how our experiences were similar, and really the psychological and sexual and all kinds of other traumas that we experienced in evangelicalism. And that's one of the big problems. That's why I'm still speaking out, though, because I will say that Christianity and other forms of religion can do a tremendous amount of harm. So while that's still happening, I'm going to keep talking about it.
Yeah, that's right. So that's one reason why the community you talk about is so necessary, because when people leave, they have this baggage from their past, and they have, and maybe with other ex-Christians, it's easier for them to deal with it, right?
Yeah, because we have a shared story. One of the things we find out is that we all have this religious trauma syndrome, and we have to deconstruct, and then we have to reconstruct. So for the last probably 2 years, that's really become my theme, is reconstruction after deconstruction. So I was for a long time, I was focused on, tearing it all down and burning it to the ground. But now I see, no, it's equally as important to build your self-image and your authentic self back up after the other aftermath is all done. So that's really what I would say I'm focusing more on now the last couple of years, is looking at cult psychology and talking to people, from different faiths and different religions and belief systems, and trying to find out how they got out and how they are reconstructing, and to give those tips and advice to other people who are trying to walk in that same journey.
All right. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to listening to your next podcast. And maybe we'll have another chat later on.
Oh, I'm sure we will. We'll have you on the Mindshift Podcast. We'll have a good chat.
All right. Sounds good, man.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. Take care.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.